Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy and specifically to talk about the banking sector because Russian companies are now struggling to be able to service their debt. And this isn't really very surprising because Vladimir Putin recently announced that GDP in 2025 only grew by 1% compared to over 4% in the previous 2 years. And a lot of that growth is actually being driven by the companies that are being sponsored directly by the Kremlin. So, commercial entities, businesses that are dependent on actual sales to third parties, are really struggling right now, partly because of the sanctions against Russian businesses. Russia historically has been a major exporter, obviously, oil and gas and things like steel and coal and lots of raw materials that Russia has an abundance of. They've been exporting them all around the world for the past 50 years or so. However, because of the sanctions, they've seen their markets severely limited. And Russian businesses have been making losses and therefore they've had to take on more debt. And that debt has got severely more expensive. So we'll go through the details in today's video. But in terms of a couple of examples of businesses that have been reported in the press, and this is coming from TASS, the Russian news agency, so I'm not just making up these numbers. It's been reported that the Russian railway system has requested a 65 billion ruble loan from the government to help it through its current problems. And this is actually less than the 200 billion that was reported in the press in November. And Russia's biggest property developer, Samolet, which is similar to Evergrande, I guess, if we're doing a comparison to China, has also asked for a deferral of 50 billion rubles of taxes because it says if it has to pay them, then it's going to have to hike up the price of all new properties in Russia. So we're starting to see a lot of businesses creaking at the seams. And one of the reasons for this is because of what's been going on with interest rates. If you've been following the channel, you'll be fully aware that interest rates in Russia are some of the highest in the world at the moment. This chart shows the movement in interest rates over the past 5 years. And I think an important thing to note is that if we look at the far left-hand side of this, before the war in Ukraine started, interest rates 5 years ago were actually sitting at around about 4%. So that's relatively normal when you compare it to the West and interest rates at the moment. But as you can see, as a direct result of the invasion of Ukraine, interest rates were hiked to 20%. And over the past 4 years, we've seen them remaining at elevated levels. And the current level of 15.5% is prohibitively high. So if you think of yourself as a business in Russia, if you've taken on debt, if you had historic debt, then it's going to be affected by these interest rates because as that debt is either floating rate, so it will automatically increase in price, or it comes up for renewal, it's going to be renewed at these higher rates. And any new debt that's been taken on in the past 4 years will be priced at these levels. And if you think about that in the context of your own personal situation, if you borrowed money and you're having to pay it back at 20% interest, it means for every $100 that you borrowed, you're having to pay $20 every single year just in interest payments, never mind trying to repay the money back. So it makes the return on investment very difficult to basically justify if you're a Russian business because you're having to work in the calculation of interest payments as well as whether or not you can make a return on investing into your expansion of your business. So what we've seen is a lot of Russian businesses haven't been expanding. They haven't been taking on that debt to basically increase their profits. And so we've got more pressure being applied on the existing profits to service these higher debt levels. So this has become a really big problem for Russian businesses. And one of the other problems, as I've just mentioned, is that GDP is now really being curtailed by the sanctions and the problems going on in Russia. And as you'll be aware, inflation has also been extremely high over the past 5 years. So that's eroded the purchasing power of money in people's pockets, and it's also reduced profit margins in Russia. So Russian companies have been hit from a number of different sides. Now, before we go on any further today, I'd like to talk to you about today's sponsor, eToro, which is one of the world's leading investment platforms and is listed on the Nasdaq. If you're like me, towards the end of the tax year is the time when you start thinking about making tax efficient investments. Do you put your money into a cash ISA or a stocks and shares ISA? Well, the great news is that eToro is offering two fantastic opportunities. On the cash side of things, it's offering one of the market leading rates. At the time of making this video, it was 4.44%. So you can get that if you put new money in, or you can also transfer over your old cash ISAs. And that's quite unusual to find a platform that will actually allow you to amalgamate all of your historic ISAs. So that's really interesting. If you're interested in doing that, click the link in the description below. It will take you straight through to the Get Started page, and within minutes, you'll be able to get that process underway. If you're more interested in a stocks and shares ISA, then the great news is that eToro offers two options: either a self-select one where you can pick the shares yourself, or a managed option. And the great news is that if you put new money in or transfer over any of your old stocks and shares ISAs, then you'll receive a bonus of up to 3%, potentially as much as £10,000. So that's definitely worth looking into. So have a look in the link below. You'll find a description there. Click it. It will take you straight through to the Get Started page, and you can get that process underway. And if we have a look at this chart, it shows two different metrics which are very key in banking. As you may be aware, I spent the first 20 years of my career working in international finance and commercial lending, so I'm quite familiar with how these things operate. What we can see here are the problem loans, which are shown in black, when they're shown in black because they're usually bad news problem loans, and the pink section shows the loans that are being restructured. And we'll come on to talk about why restructuring is really important in a moment. But let's have a look firstly at the problem loans. So if we look at quarter three of 2024, you can see that the problem loans were sitting at 9.2 trillion rubles. Trillion rubles, that sounds like a lot. Now, don't forget that the exchange rate between the ruble and the US dollar is around about 80 to 1. Let's keep it simple. It's about 77, but let's keep it simple at 80 to 1. So the numbers seem a bit more shocking in rubles, but I think the actual issue here is what's happened over the past 12 months. So between the third quarter of 2024, when it was 9.2, and the third quarter of 2025, it increased to 9.7 trillion rubles, which represents an increase of 12.5% over the past 12 months. Now, these figures are for the third quarter of 25. We don't have the final quarters yet, but I would imagine that bad loans have got severely worse in the final quarter because we saw a ramping up of the sanctions in the last quarter of 25. We've now got the two biggest oil companies in Russia having been sanctioned directly, but also there's been a clamping down on the trafficking of Russian oil, and Russia is really under pressure in terms of India has now decided to walk away from its trade relationship. So things are getting significantly worse. So the problem loans show us that things are not going well, and that's a problem not just for the companies that have got those loans, because if they can't keep up the repayments, if they can't pay the interest, then at some point, then the banks will have to make the difficult decision to close them down, to basically put them out of business, make them insolvent. But also that's a problem for the banks themselves because they've got their balance sheet and you can't just keep losing more and more money. And the problem that Russian banks have, and Russia has as a whole, is that the international markets have been closed off. So in the past, Russian businesses may have borrowed money from other banks around the world, Chinese banks, Indian banks, American banks, European banks, but not anymore. So that's a problem because it's meaning that all of the losses are going to be concentrated within Russia. So these things can spiral very quickly. So bad loans have risen quite significantly. But the pink section here talks about restructuring. And what is a restructuring? What does that mean? Well, basically, it's a bit like, let's put it into your own personal situation. If you got yourself into a whole lot of debt, if you took on tons of different credit cards, let's say you took out 10 credit cards and you were borrowing as much money as you could on all of the different credit cards and things were getting completely out of control, you were spending a lot more than you were earning on all of the interest, trying to just keep all of those credit cards alive, then you may get to the point where you're basically looking at insolvency, bankruptcy. Basically, you're going to be closed down as a person. But obviously that doesn't happen. So what would happen is that you would sit down and restructure all of your debt. So you would probably amalgamate all of those credit cards into one loan, maybe with your bank, and then work out some sort of repayment program to try to repay as much of that debt as you could. Now, depending on where you live in the world, you might have some laws that enable you to benefit from not having to pay back everybody. So you could enter into some sort of arrangement where you agree to pay back maybe 20 or 30% of the debt to some of those credit cards, and the rest of it just gets written off. And then you just have to pay that money over a number of years. So that's generally what happens in most countries, that you can agree some sort of settlement with the lenders. They'll have to take some pain and lose some money, but you basically agree to pay back as much as you can. And that's basically what a restructuring is for companies. It's exactly the same process, because banks have to face the reality of saying, okay, well, we could put this company down. We could just basically say, okay, we'll enforce on any security that we've got. We'll take control of your business and all of your assets. But what are we going to recover? What will we actually get back if we try to do a fire sale of your business? In most situations, it's not a lot. If the management say, okay, we're walking away, you can have it, take all of the assets, what are they going to be worth to you? You might get a recovery of 5 cents or 10 cents on the dollar, but you're going to have to write off 90 to 95% of your loan. So rather than doing that, what banks tend to do is enter into a restructuring, same as what we just talked about for the credit cards, where they might decide to either reduce the amount of debt, so write some of it off, or spread it out over a longer period. So say, okay, you've got 20 years to pay this off, or do something clever where they reduce the amount of interest or they reduce the amount of repayments. Just make it easier for that company to get through the next 12, 18 months or so to see if things improve. So this is what's happening in Russia at the moment. A lot of these deals are being restructured. And we have a look at the details. You can see that in the third quarter of 2024, the total amount of loans being restructured were 10.9 trillion rubles. Now, that is a lot. That's more than the bad loans. And then if we look at what happened in the most recent quarter, it increased to 14 trillion rubles, which represents an increase year on year of over 28%. So we've seen a huge jump in the number of loans being restructured. And the reason why this is important is because it tells us there are really big problems in Russia at the moment, because restructuring in many cases is just a situation whereby you kick the can down the road. You basically put things off for another year or 18 months or 2 years because you don't want to have to report that bad debt. So if I agree to restructure a facility for a company that's really struggling at the moment, I might be able to put together a deal whereby they don't have to make any repayments and only pay a very small amount of interest. So they can keep that loan alive. It looks good on my balance sheet as a bank because I can say, oh, I've restructured that loan and that company is now meeting all of its obligations under the new arrangements. But if those obligations are wafer thin, there's basically nothing for them to do. What it's doing is showing the loan as a performing asset. It's showing it as it's going okay on my balance sheet, so I don't have to write it off as a bank. But realistically, I'm just deferring that point another year or two. So this is a very clever way of Russian banks basically holding back on the amount of bad debts and write-offs that they're having to report. But realistically, it's not solving the problem. It's literally just pushing it further down the road. And I think it's important to see that the number of restructurings are really exploding at the moment. And I would imagine when we see the figures for Q4, there's going to be an even bigger jump in restructurings. And I mentioned at the start of today's video that the Russian Railways network and the biggest property developer have asked for a restructuring. This is what we're seeing in China at the moment in a lot of the property deals. Many of them did go bust, like Evergrande, but a lot of the other big property companies have agreed some sort of restructuring with their banks to give them access to more money to carry on trading. But realistically, a lot of these companies are zombies. They're basically walking dead. They aren't going to survive if you took a genuine commercial banking approach to what they're doing. And in terms of the sectors that are most affected by these restructurings, well, let's have a look at it, and it won't be a surprise to you to see that the biggest sector is oil and gas. Obviously, oil and gas businesses have been completely devastated by the sanctions. They're still struggling in terms of being able to find buyers for their products, and that's going to get worse in 2026 because India has now walked away from those purchases in order to maintain its good trading relationship with the USA, which is its biggest single export market. The equally big sector is industrials, so basically export of raw materials, and lots of businesses that are sending things across the world. They have been devastated by the sanctions. We've also got the metals and coal industry, which have been severely impacted. The financial sector has also been hurt because Russia has been excluded from lots of different payment systems, and you can't trade with most Russian financial institutions these days. So they've had to just focus in on Russia and friendly nations. And then we've got a big other section as well. So there's a lot of different industries that are being hurt at the moment in Russia who are now having to restructure their debt. And the only reason they're restructuring it is because they can't afford to keep servicing it and repaying it. And if they didn't restructure, then this would be a massive write-off. We would see an implosion in the Russian economy. And I just wanted to finish off today on this table, which is the latest update from the Bank of Russia in terms of their outlook for a number of different metrics. So let's have a quick look. So their updated forecast for inflation for the next 12 months is somewhere between 4.5 and 5.5%. So that's above the target rate of 4%. It actually looks a bit ambitious, to be honest. And the reason why that's important is that high levels of inflation continue to erode profit margins for Russian businesses because they're not increasing their prices at these levels. So they're constantly seeing their margins being cut. We've got inflation at 4% for 2027. I think we can ignore that because that's a long way down the track and unlikely as it stands at the moment. Now, GDP, I think, is one of the key issues here. The forecast for next year, this year, is somewhere between 0.5 and 1.5%. So if we take a middle point of that of 1%, that's the same as what Russia achieved in 2025, which is 4 times lower than it's achieved in 2024 and 2023. So this represents a severe slowdown in the Russian economy. A lot of that GDP is driven by the companies that are sponsored by the Kremlin, the ones that are helping for the war effort in Ukraine. So that isn't a reflection of what's happening for commercial entities. They're most likely seeing a contraction at the moment. In terms of the interest rates, now this is one of the key issues. It's expected that over the next 12 months, interest rates are going to be between 13.5 and 14.5%. So again, a very, very high level. If you've got a lot of debt and you're having to pay 14% interest on it, that's absolutely enormous. It's very difficult to be able to afford that. So many Russian companies are still going to struggle going forward, even if they're doing okay. When you've got that high price on your debt, it's really a nightmare to keep it paid. And then the oil price is something we discussed in other videos, but the Bank of Russia is saying that the average price of Russian oil will be $45 per barrel. That's $14 less than the $59 in the original budget for 2026. It means that oil businesses are really going to struggle, but actually the prices that Urals are selling for at the moment are a lot less than 45. So it's going to be much worse than that is projecting. So the overall summary of today's video is that what we're seeing in Russia at the moment is that lots of companies are struggling with their debt burden. This is partly as a result of the sanctions, which has severely reduced the revenues that these companies are earning. Many of Russian businesses have high fixed costs. So that cut in revenue is leading to a massive fall in profits. Some businesses are actually making losses. So they're struggling to be able to maintain their original debt. But debt prices have gone up severely over the past 4 years because interest rates have been hiked. They're currently running at over 15%, so that's an absolute nightmare if you've got a ton of debt. If you need to borrow more money, you're going to have to borrow at those levels. And obviously, banks put a profit margin on top of the 15%, so you're probably going to have to pay 17 or 18 or 20% for that debt. That is unaffordable for most businesses. It's not sustainable. And what we are now seeing is a huge wave of bad loans and restructurings coming through in the banking sector in Russia. Russian businesses don't really have the option of going to overseas lenders. They're focused on Russian banks. So all of these losses are now concentrated within Russia. This could mean a wave of bad debts for Russian banks over the next few years, which could mean that Russian banks themselves have problems with liquidity and insolvency. So we're starting to see credit deteriorating in Russia. We're seeing banks struggling under the pressure of these loans. Companies can't afford to keep paying the interest. Everything is being restructured, but that doesn't solve the problem. It just kicks the can further down the road. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. You found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking. That's what I'm trying to do, provoke some thoughts. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Don't forget, I'm currently running my competition where you can win my property located close to the beach in the UK or a cash alternative prize. If you'd like to get involved, please scan the QR code on the screen now or click the link in the description below. Thank you so much to everyone that's supporting me in other ways. If you bought me a coffee, sent me YouTube super thanks, or signed up as a patron or a member, really, really appreciate that support. Thank you so much. And here's something to put a smile on your face.